Hello, my name is David Brown. I'm an associate professor of finance at the University of Arizona, and today I want to tell you about the underperformance of target date funds. Now, target date funds have arisen as a way to address some of the challenges of saving for retirement. One of the biggest challenges is that retirement planning is hard. Two Nobel Prize winners, Bob Merton and Bill Sharpe, have both commented that retirement savings problems are among the hardest problems in finance. The second part of the challenge is that individuals are not very good at making financial decisions. This is for a number of reasons, but at the end of the day, individuals need help. So target date funds have arisen as an answer to that challenge. TDFs are appealing to investors because they are a one-stop shop for retirement savings. And I'll show you more about what they do in just a second. But really what's enabled them to grow was that in 2006, the Pension Protection Act allowed them to become the default investment option in people's retirement accounts. Since then, TDF assets have grown from about $100 billion to over $1.4 trillion. That continues to be fueled by the fact that 70% of current inflows into retirement accounts are going into target date funds. So this is clearly a very large part of the retirement savings sector, and it's only becoming more important every day. Target date funds follow what's called a glide path. That's how the equity and other asset allocation changes throughout time. So in this graph, you can see that on the left-hand side, when you're many years from retirement, you have a high portion allocated to equity. And then as you move through time, you're going to allocate more of your assets to fixed income. So target date funds provide that dynamic asset allocation and do that for investors. Moreover, within each asset class, they also provide diversification. They diversify within stocks, within bonds, within international markets, etc. So it's really handling a lot of the investment problems for investors, and thus is that one-stop shop. So all that investors really have to do is pick their target retirement date. Now that can be harder than it sounds though, because there are big differences across target date funds, starting with the glide path. Glide paths vary substantially, first because of what they're targeting. Some target to go to retirement, others plan to take you through retirement all the way to when you're no longer retired. The other big difference is that they vary greatly on risk and return trade-offs. So the equity allocation in some TDFs is going to be much higher than in others, and how they change that equity versus bond allocation over time is also going to change. That means different risk and then also different return profiles from those TDFs. And lastly, they're also going to differ on how they diversify. Some will include many asset classes, some will include only a few. And how many funds they include within each asset class will also vary. Now, beyond the glide path, how they implement those glide paths is also going to be different. For example, some funds are going to focus on active mutual funds within them. Other target date funds are going to hold passive index funds, and others are going to hold a mix of the two. Now, once they pick what kind of funds to hold, they also have to pick which actual funds to pick. Turns out that most TDF providers put their own mutual funds in those funds, but that is going to differ from provider to provider. And finally, there are also going to be differences in fees. Some TDFs charge two layers of fees, both for the underlying mutual funds and for the TDF on top of that. Some only charge one, some charge the other. So again, large variation across these different dimensions, making it hard to pick which TDF is best for an investor. So that's really where our research question comes in. How should we think about evaluating TDFs? And how should investors pick, quote unquote, a good TDF? So the challenge here is that good really does depend on investors' preferences, both for risk and glide path. So we can't say a lot about what's good for you versus good for someone else because we don't know your preferences. Good also depends on investors' outside option. What I mean by that is what an investor could do if not in the TDF. So for example, they could do it themselves, figure out their asset allocation across all these different asset classes and what stocks to buy. That's a lot of work. So TDFs clearly provide a lot of value above what an investor would do as their outside option of do it themselves. That's not really the only outside option though. The outside option we want to consider is an outside option that's created based on building target date funds with ETFs. So our idea is to benchmark each target date fund to an ETF-based replicating fund. Now in doing this, we're taking the glide path as given. So we're not adjusting the risk or return profile of a given TDF. Instead, we're simply taking that TDF and its holdings, replacing whatever funds they picked with similar low-cost passive ETFs, allowing us to assess how well do TDFs implement their glide paths. So that's really the benchmark we're providing here. Now, let me give you a little bit more detail on how we actually construct these benchmarks. And here's one example from the Fidelity Freedom 2030 Fund, which is the biggest TDF in our sample. Now, what you see in this table is a list of positions held in the target date fund. Now, on the left, you can see the amount of money allocated to each of these different funds. So that's the asset allocation that we get from holdings data for each of these target date funds each quarter. We can then take each fund within the target date fund, we can then take each mutual fund within the target date fund and match that to a corresponding ETF. We're going to focus on a set of 50 Vanguard ETFs that are highly liquid, relatively low cost, and easy for individual investors to access. So once we make that match, what you can see is that most tend to be very highly correlated. They tend to be in the high 90s for the most part. There are some asset classes, like commodities, that don't match quite as well. So we're not going to get perfect matches for all the underlying mutual funds and target date funds, but overall we do a pretty good job, and I'll show you evidence of that in a minute. Continuing with the Freedom 2030 example, I want to show you how we benchmark a TDF to its replicating fund. So in the Fidelity Freedom 2030, you can see that from 2006, a $100,000 investment would have grown to $233,000 for a 6.23% annual return. If we layer on the replicating fund, well, you can see right away its performance is going to be better. You start with that same $100,000 and it grows to $260,000 over the sample period for a 7.06% annual return, or outperformance of 11.5%, or in this case, $27,000. So the way we measure that is our return spread. The return spread is the difference in those annual returns. In this case, that's going to be 83 basis points that the replicating fund outperforms the target date fund. The other thing to notice from this example is that the return correlations are very, very high. In this case, it's 99.3% at the portfolio level. Many of our examples are very similar to that in our full sample. So because the Fidelity Freedom 2030 Fund is just one example, I want to show you our full sample results. And here I'm showing you the return spread on an annual basis across our full sample. The return spread, recall, is the difference between the replicating fund return and the underlying TDF return. So what you can see is that this number bounces around a lot, and it ranges and is mostly positive. To make it a little bit easier, let me show you the average. It's about 1% per year. So that means that target date funds are underperforming the replicating fund benchmark by 1% per year. Now, in retirement terms, when you're talking about 30 or 40-year retirement horizons, plus potentially 30 more years in retirement, that 1% is really going to add up over time. So it's important that we understand where this 1% difference is coming from. So what we can do is we can decompose that return spread into three different pieces. The first is going to be a timing piece. So because we only have quarterly holdings, we can't exactly match how a target date fund changes its asset allocation over time. As a result, the target date fund may over or underperform relative to the holdings that we have a snapshot of as of the beginning of the quarter. So any difference there is going to be picked up by the timing measure. The second piece is going to be the active measure. And this is going to be the difference between how the holdings of the target date fund perform relative to those matched ETFs. Now, this is going to be a before fee comparison, so fees aren't included in that at all. Lastly, we're going to look at the fee gap, which is the difference in the fees of the target date fund, both the target date fund itself and its underlying mutual funds, versus the fees of the ETFs. So when we return to our graph now of return spread, we can layer on each of these different pieces. The first piece is the timing piece. And here you can see there's actually not a lot going on. There's a little bit of variation, and mostly it's a pretty flat line. The average is about 5 basis points per year. So this is not the major source of the underperformance in target date funds. If we move on to active, we start to see where some of this underperformance is coming from. When I layer on the active measure, here you see one thing really obvious is that most of the volatility in that line is coming from the active performance. And that's not surprising, because sometimes active funds are going to outperform their benchmarks. Sometimes they're going to underperform. What we really care about is over time, how do they do? In this case, they're underperforming the passive ETFs by 41 basis points per year. So that's even before fees. So once we layer fees on, it's going to become even more significant. What that means is that target date funds, on average, are putting poorly performing mutual funds into their portfolios. Now, the last piece is the fee gap, the difference between the fees, and here we see it's very stable, which makes sense. Fees don't change a lot year to year. It's also gradually decreasing through time, consistent with the fee compression we've seen in the mutual fund industry over the last few decades. However, it's still a big number. On average, it's 57 basis points per year that the target date funds are charging. So about 55% of the total cost is coming from the fee gap, 40% is coming from picking poor active funds, and that last 4 or 5% is coming from negative timing. Now let's see what this looks like in a dollar basis. So what I'm showing you in this graph is the total cumulative underperformance of target date funds in dollars. And what you can see is that it's been increasing dramatically over time, really with the growth in TDF assets. By the end of our sample, the cumulative cost is $35 billion, which is clearly very significant. Now, where does that come from? We can decompose it the same way we've done in the last analysis. Here we can see that on a valuated basis, $30 billion of that is coming from the fee gap. So that's the main source of the underperformance. The second biggest piece, though, is the active piece. So funds are picking poor performing mutual funds to put into their target date funds. And that's an underperformance of $6 billion on a gross basis before fees. Finally, the timing measure on an aggregate value basis is actually negative, suggesting the TDF industry and its rebalancing within quarter is actually adding value for investors. So what can investors do? We have two recommendations. First, investors can pick a good TDF family. And that's going to be based on our return spread measure, which again relatively measures the implementation of a TDF's glide path. The second thing you can do is do it yourself. Now, as we look at the return spread by family, we can see some pretty striking differences. Starting with Vanguard, we can see that the return spread is very, very low. Vanguard is the biggest provider in the industry, holding 38% of the assets, and their return spread is 1 basis point per year. They have a little bit higher fee gap than that, but good timing actually offsets that. JP Morgan also does quite well. In this case, their larger fee gap is offset by even better timing and also good active fund picks. On the other end of the spectrum are Fidelity, American funds, and kind of all the smaller TDF providers that really perform quite poorly, both on a fee gap basis and in picking poor active funds for their portfolios. All right, now what if you want to do it yourself? Our recommendation here is to build an aggregate replicating fund. So you can take all the TDFs in the industry, take their average holdings, so you get an average glide path, and build a replicating fund based on that. We call ours passive replications of funds, or PROFs. So we can do this a couple ways. You can do all 50 ETFs we use in the Vanguard sample, or we can consolidate down to either 6, 13, or 21 different ETFs, depending on how many positions you want to manage in your own portfolio. Now, how do they do? And what you can see is that the PROFs outperform significantly. Starting with the PROF 50, the outperformance is 50 basis points per year relative to that aggregate TDF. If we compare to individual TDFs, then the PROF 50 outperforms 91% of those other TDFs, and it does so on average by 88 basis points per year. Now, if you don't want to manage 50 ETFs in your portfolio, which I can understand, well, then we can propose that you manage 6 ETFs instead. Your performance is not quite as good over the sample period. We have 34 basis points of outperformance rather than 50, but that's still significant. And if you compare to individual TDFs, you're still beating 87% of the TDFs that are out there, on average by 80 basis points per year. To conclude, there are 3 main takeaways from our research. First, target date funds can be benchmarked or evaluated using replicating funds. Evaluating TDFs based on those replicating funds shows significant underperformance to the tune of nearly $35 billion over our sample and almost $9 billion in 2019 alone. And finally, investors can protect themselves by sticking to better fund families or ultimately doing it themselves with PROFs. Thank you very much for your time.